Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcodeur.com, and this is a 60-minute deep dive in Express. So for the next 60 minutes, I'm going to go as deep as I can into Express. Then I'm going to try to be methodical about it so that way we can really understand what Express is. So first, what is Express? Express is a framework for building web servers in Node. Node is a JavaScript runtime. It's a piece of software that's designed to be able to run JavaScript outside of the browser. And it has APIs for building web servers. And then Express is built on top of those APIs to make it easier to build web servers. Okay, so in order to do this tutorial, you will need to have Node installed. So if you don't have Node installed, head over to nodejs.org and install it. Okay, current version 16.91. Okay, so I'm going to open up my terminal. Make sure that I have Node installed by doing node -- version. And see, I'm running 16.90. Okay, cool. So long as you have Node, we can do Express. So the first step is we need to create a new Express project or a new Node project. So notice I have a blank folder here, Express 60, which is my Express in 60 minutes folder. And first thing I'm going to do is actually I'm going to initiate a Git repo, because I'm going to actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through portions of the lesson. I'm going to start saving them on different branches, so that way you can explore the different branches to see like the different parts of the lesson. So I'm going to do a new Git repo, so git init. And right now we're on the main branch, as you can see in my prompt. And if you're wondering why my prompt looks cool, it's because I use something called starship.rs, which customizes my prompt. Okay, so that's the tool that I use. It's available, I think you can use it regardless of what operating system you have. So that's a thing you can use if you want to decorate your prompt. Okay, so if you're wondering why my prompt looks cool. Okay, so now that I have a Git repo initiated in here, and I'm currently on the main branch, so this first part of the lesson will be on the main branch. Okay, what we need to do is initiate a Node project. And the way we do that is we do npm init. But if you just do npm init, what's going to happen is you're going to have to answer a whole litany of questions, which I'd just rather not do. I'd rather accept all the default answers. So I'm going to do a -y, which then just accepts all the default answers. And then it generates what's called a package.json. The package.json is sort of the heart of Node. Any Node project revolves around the package.json. It just tells you everything about that particular project. Okay, so right now, generally the name is going to be the name of the folder. By default, this main, which means the main file of the project, is always going to be index.js. You can change it. And then you have scripts and some other fun things. There's a bunch of stuff we can add here. Okay, but we'll do it one step at a time. So what we're learning about is Express. Okay, so I can do npm install express. So npm, because that's Node's package manager tool. Install, because I want to install something, and express is the thing I want to install. And if you're wondering what else you can install, anything that's available on npm is available at npmjs.com. So if you're looking for libraries on anything, you can just go here and browse and find libraries you may want to use, read their documentation. Very fun activity. I do it all the time. I just go there and just take a look at the things that are there and try them out. Cool. So npm install express. Now, so that's going to install, and we're going to see here that it shows up under dependencies. That means it's been installed. So if you're ever wondering what's installed, what does this project use, your package.json is always your source of truth. Now you might notice that it also created a file called Packagelock. This is a file you never need to touch. What it does is that it not only tracks what your dependencies are, but it tracks the dependencies of the dependencies. The purpose being so that way it can pick up on whether there's any shared dependencies between your dependencies. I'm using that word a lot. So that way if you ever need to re-download your dependencies, I can do it pretty quick. Because here's the thing. See this Node modules folder? That's where everything I install gets put in. And notice, there's a lot more folders than just Express. Why? Because all of these other folders are dependencies of Express. Like if I go to Express's package.json, I can see Express's dependencies, so see lots of stuff. and then those dependencies have dependencies and so forth. So the package lock is what tracks that, and the beauty of that's what Packagelock does, and the beauty of having this package.json with dependencies is that if I decided one day just to delete the node modules folder, boom, gone. I don't have to go install all of those libraries one by one. I can just type in npm install. It'll read the dependency section of my package.json and reinstall those libraries. Boop. Okay, and see, there's node modules again. Now, another note is you generally do not want node modules to be pushed up to GitHub. So typically the next step is we should create a .gitignore file. And generally the two things you generally always want to make sure they're in there are going to be node modules, so the folder node modules, and a .env file, which I'm not sure we'll talk about today, but we may get to that. Okay, but those are the two things we want to always make sure that are put away. Perfect. Okay, so that's good. Now we just need to create a file. We can call the file whatever we want. Typically, for Express, I'd rather call it server.js. Okay, because it represents our server, or the thing that turns on our server. Okay. Now let's see here. So if we want to create an Express server, first we have to bring in the library. So we have to declare a variable, const express, which that's just the way you normally do it. And how would you know what the way to normally do it is? You would read Express's documentation that kind of details like sort of what are the common practices. But typically you create a variable called express. We use this function called require that's built into Node. And whenever you use require, if I pass it a name like express, like I didn't pass it like a path, a directory path, then what it does, it assumes that I want something out of this node modules folder. So it looks in node modules and looks for a folder called express, which should exist right there, express, and then it's going to look inside that package.json to figure out like, hey, what's the file to import? And it knows that because Express's package.json has a main of, it's somewhere in there. Boop, 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 boop. Somewhere it details it. Files. I think this is technically what it's going to end up loading up. Again, there's different ways of setting up package.json, so you'll see a lot of diversity between different package.jsons. Okay. But essentially what it does, it loads that library in. That's what it's doing. So I'm getting all the stuff from the node, the Express library, and saving it in this variable called Express. Now Express allows us to create a web server, and the first step in doing that is we have to create an object that's usually referred to as the application object. Essentially represents our app and the logic of our web server. So we say const app equals express. Again, the variable's name is not fixed. I can call this something else if I want to. Like I could call it web server if I want to. Okay, it's just traditionally called app. I'll call it web server. I think for many of you probably watching this, that might just help make it a little clear. Okay, it's just usually like as developers, we think of whatever we're building as an app, so things are oftentimes called app. And it's a lot less letters to type. But I'll call it web server because we're building a web server. So essentially, I have this variable called web server, which represents my server. Like what's a server? A server is just a program that's going to run on a TCP port. So all computers have TCP, which is Transmission Control Protocol. That is the technology that actually discusses how computers send messages to each other. Okay? So you ever heard like IP addresses and ports and whatnot? This is all TCP. So every computer can communicate with other computers via TCP. Okay? And the way TCP works is that messages are sent and addressed to another computer, where another program is listening for the message. But the thing is that you might have lots of programs listening for a message. So there has to be a way to differentiate the different programs you have listening. So what you do is that any computer can establish, say this program is listening on a particular port, which is just a number. And the number has to be something that fits within a 8-bit unsigned integer. Now what does that mean, 8-bit unsigned? 8 bits represents the amount of memory used to store the number, so 8 bits. And unsigned represents whether the number can be positive or negative. If it's unsigned, it has to be a positive integer. So an unsigned 8-bit integer just means a positive number that can fit in 8 bits of memory. So what is the largest number that can fit in 8 bits of largest positive number that can fit in 8 bits? It's like 65,500 something. Okay, so bottom line is I can assign any number from 0, well actually I think from 1 to 65,000 to be the port that the software listens on. You usually are going to choose something 3,000 or above to avoid a lot of like sort of standard ones. You pick them up over time, which ones are like typically used by certain pieces of software. I mean, you have 65,000 possibilities, so you can always find one you can use. Cool. So, but that's the idea. So we're gonna create this program that we're gonna say is gonna be listening on my computer, okay? And it's gonna listen for any messages that come in through a particular port number. Okay, so if a message comes in and it's targeting that particular port number, my software is gonna hear it. Okay. So how would I do that? How do I set up a listener? Okay, so what you do is you take your, whatever you save the application object, so usually I'd call this app, but I'm calling it web server. So we just say web server.listen. I want my web server to listen for messages. And then I give it a number. Again, any number between like 1 and 65,000. You know, typical numbers are going to be like 3,000, 4,000. Skip 6,000. Don't do 6,000. There's for some reason the browser ignores 6,000. There's some long-standing historical reason for that. And any number in between. So I could just do 7777. Okay, that's going to be a number, lucky sevens. So I'm going to say I want my web server to listen on port 7777. And then what you can do is you can pass in a function. Usually the point of this function is just to kind of like print some text, so that way you know the server's listening. So I'll just do a console log, and I am assuming that you know JavaScript. Okay, so I'm not going to explain what console log does. You should know. If you don't know what console log is, then you need to go like watch my intro to JavaScript videos, because this is not, you're not here yet. Okay, but console.log, the web server is listening on port 7777. Okay, there we go. That's literally the minimum amount of code that it takes to create a web server, okay, with Express. So now what I can do is I can just run this file. So I would type in node server.js and see it says web server listening on port 777. So how would I check to see? There's a couple different ways I can test to see, hey, is it actually listening? The easiest way is I can just use the browser. Okay, now again, this is listening on a port on my computer. So what's the address of my computer? Technically, when you're on your computer and you're trying to refer to your own computer, the IP address is 127.0.0.1. That's the IP address of you when on your computer. So if I need to refer to my computer while I'm on my computer, that's my IP address. That's always just that's the IP address of the computer you're on. So I could do, so that's my computer. Then I can do a colon, and then I can specify which port I want to send the message to. So I want to send it to port 777. Okay, and notice I get this message here, cannot get. Let's make that a little bit bigger so you can see that a little bit clearer. See, cannot get. Okay, that's good. Okay, that means the server's working. Because let me send it to a port where I don't have a server running. So I'll do 127.0.0.1. And we'll do 7778. Notice here I get the site can't be reached. That's different. That's not good because that means there is no server running. So this, I either sent it to the wrong port or wrong address, or my server's not on. Okay. Luckily, this is the wrong address. But just so that way you can tell, like when is it. Sometimes getting an error is good if it's an error that your running server would generate, not the lack of a server would generate. So it's kind of good to know the difference between the two. So this is what I'd see if my server's off. This is what I'm going to see when my server's on, when I'm using Express. Now, memorizing 127.0.01 can be a little not the easiest thing to do in the world. Okay, so what computers do is they have another name. They have a pseudonym for that IP address to make it easier for you to refer to your own computer, and it's called localhost. Okay, and I get the same result. So instead of having to type in 127.0.01, I can type in localhost. Okay, cool. So that is that. Okay, so that we've created a server. It's not doing anything, but again, we know that it is listening. We notice that, hey, if I send a message to 7777, it has received the message, because it gave me some sort of acknowledgement, even though it didn't do anything of any use, that it can hear the message. There's also tools that you can use to help you test these out. Okay, so if you don't necessarily want to use the browser, or sometimes you're going to have such complicated requests that you can't just test them in the browser like that, you can use tools such as Postman. Okay, so if I do, well, I activate Postman through a thing, but you can install Postman. Just look up Postman. There's a few of these. I'll show you each one. But in these, what you can do is you can just type in the URL. So in Postman, okay, it looks like it just got updated. Okay, that's all well and good. All good, good. So basically, I can sit there and say, hey, I want to send a request to localhost 7777, and if I click send, and see, I get the cannot get. Okay, so the only difference, the benefit of using something like Postman is I can now give more complicated requests, and I can set all the little details of the request. We'll get into that as we go along. Okay, well, that's Postman. And then there's also Insomnia. So let me just close this window. Insomnia, I'm starting to like more and more. But they do the same thing. So here's Insomnia. It's another tool that I can use to test the request. So again, I can just clear this out and just say, hey, I want to send the request to localhost 7777. Okay, and I hit send. And again, I get that cannot get message. Okay, so these are just tools to manufacture test requests. I just want to see, hey, if I send a request to the address that should be receiving them, do I have any acknowledgement that it got sent? So that way you know your server is working, that it's running. And then there's another one that you can install as a tool right in your VS Code, Thunder Client. Okay, so you can install that extension. And then I don't even have to open up another piece of software. I can just open up Thunder Client and make a request, just like I could in Postman and Insomnia. Localhost 7777, and then I'm going to hit send. And see, I get the, oh, because it's a post request, so let me change it back to a get. I get cannot get. Okay. Now we see this error, cannot get, so let me preview. Okay. We get this message, cannot get. What does this mean? It just means that there's no response, because again, we haven't told our server how to respond to this request. Every request is made up of two pieces. It's made up of the verb. By default, when I enter things into a browser, it's always a get request. So it doesn't matter what I type in the browser, it's always going to be get. Get just means I'm getting something. And then the second thing is it was called the endpoint, or the URL. It's anything after the host. The host is always this piece. Or like if I go to google.com, google.com is what's called the host, and then the URL is really anything from / going forward. Okay? So when our browser, okay, let's see if I can go find a good picture of this. Images.google.com. Okay, an HTTP request. When our computer like sends a message, like we sit there and say, hey, I want to go to google.com, your computer actually communicates through what's called HTTP. Okay, so TCP again is the physical sort of way that computers communicate with each other. HTTP is one standard of how to send those messages between computers. So technically, your browser is sending a little text message like this, and basically it always starts off with this like word, could be get, post, some sort of verb. There's a standard set of them. Then it's the URL. So notice it's not like google.com. See, the host is set separately. So this would say like google.com, and this would say like /docs or something. So this is the URL, and then this is the particular communication protocol. So this is like HTTP version 1. There's now HTTP 2 as well. Okay, and then you have these keys and values. These are called headers. And they oftentimes just contain sort of like data that's useful for knowing how to interpret the response, and so you can handle it. So they mean different things, like what kind of data is being sent over, and what language is it in, and things like that. But these are called headers. And then once you're done with the headers, there's always a line break. Okay, so there's a break of the line. And then anything after the line break is referred to as the body of the request, which is just text that could be formatted as JSON, XML, what's called URL encoded data. It's some sort of text data put together in some sort of way. But the thing is that whatever server listens for this message can then take this message apart and then make it something usable. That's what Express does for us. Express reads these messages. We never have to deal with this. Express is going to read this message and break this thing into pieces that we can use. So it can store the body in an object that we can then use and grab its individual pieces. It'll store the headers in a separate object that we can access. It'll know what the verb is. It'll know what the URL is, and we can then use that to create logic to respond to the request. Okay, it's kind of like a chef. A chef gets like a little thing from the waiter that's writing down like what the order is. Okay, even though that's just a little piece of paper that says get me a fettuccine alfredo, the chef knows how to turn it into something tangible. Okay, so these HTTP requests, these are like orders at a restaurant, like little order tickets. And then our web server is what prepares the meal, the response. Okay, so let's show you how we can do that. Okay, so let's go over here and say we're going to do web server.all. So whenever you take whatever your app object, in case again the thing I'm saving in web server, normally I'd call it app, but sometimes I just like to be different. So if I say web server.all, this listens for all requests. Okay, so this means it doesn't matter what the verb is. It could be get, post, put, whatever. Okay, and then we generally pass it a URL. So I'm going to say asterisk. Asterisk means any URL. So I don't care what URL it is. So any verb, any URL, this one route what's called a route will handle it. So this is like a catch-all route. Okay, if it doesn't go anywhere else, it's going to go here. Okay, the reason you would do this is typically if you want to do your own custom 404 messages. Like, you don't want it to say cannot get. You want it to come up with your own sort of custom error page for when they do something you didn't plan for. So you do what's called a catch-all route. But we're going to just use it to kind of show you how this all works. So what happens is that when you're writing a route, again, we're going to use some sort of function. There'll be other ones we'll see in a little bit of time. Okay. That will allow us to specify some more details about sort of like what verb, what URL we want to respond to. Well, here we're saying pretty much for any method, so get, post, put, doesn't matter what the method is, and for any URL, we want this function to run, because that's pretty much how a web server works. It's just saying, hey, if this is what you ordered, this is like, here's your order ticket, this is the function that will deliver you your final order. Okay, so this is essentially the order, any request for anything. And then this is the function that will get you what any verb for anything will receive. Okay, and this function always receives two things. It receives the request object, which is a object that has all the details of the request. So all that stuff you saw in that little order ticket, that HTTP message, gets broken down and stored in this request object. And then we'll have some tools that we can use to respond in the response object. Okay? So the function always receives request and response, request and response, request and response. Okay. Now, in this case, what we're going to do is I'm going to respond. Okay, my response, and I'm going to send actually I'm going to do what's called there's a couple different ways you can do a response. I could send a text response by doing response.send. Okay, and you can just send a text message saying like, it works. Okay, so that's what I'll do there. So what I'm going to do is the problem is the server's already running, and the server is still going to do what it was doing before, which was nothing, because it didn't read my new code, it read my old code. So in order for the server to use my new code, I have to restart the server. So I'm going to restart the server, and now when I go to the browser, I can pretty much go to anywhere. So let's go to localhost 7777, and it says it works. But because I said all, I use that asterisk for catch all, I could literally put any URL I want, and it's going to give me the same response because it catches all URLs. Okay, so it's just gonna just give me that response. Okay, pretty cool. That's neat. Now, a couple things we can do to start making this a little bit easier. Oftentimes, writing request and response can be a little tedious, so people will shorten this and make this rec for short for request, and we'll make this res short for response. So this means this would then be res.send, which is a little bit easier. So I could do that. Okay, I could also send JSON data. So I could just take, say, res.json, put a JavaScript object in there, and whatever object I put in there will be sent as data, as JSON data. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to regurgitate some of the things we have in the request so you can see it. So we're going to have our headers, which are going to be inside rec.headers, because again, that request object has all these things inside of it. It's going to have the URL, so we're going to say rec.url. It's going to have the host, so we're going to say rec.host. Okay, technically host name. Okay, we're going to say rec. What else we want to get from there? Oh, method. So we're going to say the method. So rec.method. Okay, and so we can see all these details. So we can see that this rec object here has all these cool properties that gives us the details of the request, so we can like go in there and say, hey, what do we got here? Okay, so let me restart the server. And now that restarting the server all the time, that gets really annoying, right? There's a way to avoid that. So what you do is you're going to install another library called Nodamon. Now, Nodamon is something you don't need to actually run the server. It's just something we're going to use in development to kind of automatically restart the server for us. That's all Nodamon does. When we run a file with Nodamon, it'll pay attention to any changes of JavaScript files in that folder. And if we change a JavaScript file in that folder, it'll stop that file and then rerun it. So that way we don't have to keep rerunning it ourselves. So to do that, we just do npm install. But we don't want it as a dependency. We want it as a dev dependency because we don't need it when the program's actually running in its final form. It's just there for development purposes. So we're going to say save dev, meaning save as a dev dependency. And we're going to say Nodamon. Nodamon. So I install Nodamon. Now I should see it in my package.json once it's done installing. And see, there we go. So we have a separate section called dev dependencies. And what's important is that dev dependencies is like if you deploy to using a service like Heroku or Netlify, Vercel, any of these services, if they see dependencies listed as dev dependencies, they will not install them for deployment or for production because you're saying that basically I don't need this to run the program. A good way to think about it is if I have to write the word require anywhere in my code, if I ever have to do this to bring in a library, it's a dependency, not a dev dependency. A dev dependency is always going to be something that you're not importing or really using anywhere in your actual code. Nowhere in my code will I ever write Nodamon. Cool. So now that I have Nodamon installed, I could just do Nodamon, okay, Nodamon server.js. Cool. Nodamon server.js. Okay, so now I should be able to go here and take a look and, get the details. See, I'm getting back the headers. So here's all that stuff I said we'd get back. There's the headers, which is again, if we go back to that request, it's originally coming in a form like this, and Express is parsing that text message and giving us a nice JavaScript object like this, so we can work with it and grab things if we need to. There's the URL. So again, the URL is always just the part that's at the end of the URL. Okay, so always this is what's called the end point. It's the end of the URL. And the host is this part. Okay, again, the host is this. So localhost is the host. And then the method, again, the browser always makes a GET request. But if I were to use Thunder client again, I go like the /cheese, and I make it a post request. See, I still get all the headers. So we're still getting all these headers. There's the URL. The host is localhost, except now the method is post. So you see, like, it's getting the message. It's parsing that little like order ticket, and then we're getting all those details in that request object. That's going to allow us to make sure that whatever that request is, we know how to respond to it correctly. Okay, that's sort of the what makes it all work. Cool. And a couple other things we can do is, instead of actually writing a request like this, it's like a catch-all, where basically like this right now, all URLs will get this message. I don't necessarily want that. I want like special things. So I could take again my app object, which right now we're calling web server, and I can actually specify the method and say, hey, I only want this for get requests. And see, notice every time I make a change, Notamon is updating, restarting the server down here. But I only want this to be for get requests to /cheese. That's going to be the endpoint or the URL. And whenever a get request is made to /cheese, I want to run this function, recres. Okay, and then I could do something like this. I can respond res.send. And I could even send HTML. Like, the cool thing about res.send, it picks up on what you're doing. So if I send HTML, it'll notice. So I can be like h1 hello world. Okay, and see, the server automatically restarts, so I don't have to do anything there. So see, if I go to /cheese now, I get hello world. Because in my server I said if it's a get request, and again the browser is always a get request, to /cheese, and that was the end of the URL. So again, that's the end of the URL here. Okay. When these two things match, run this function. And essentially that's how you make your web server. You're just going to create all these, register all these possibilities. You're going to say, hey, if this is true, then do this. If this is the mix of verb and URL, then do this. Those two variables really are kind of like how you make your order. I'm going to say, I want a post to /this. I want to make a get to /that. And it's kind of like, again, ordering off a food menu. And these routes, these functions, technically this function would be referred to as a controller. So this whole thing is a route. This function that actually does the responding is referred to as the controller function. So the idea is that a way a web server works is that it routes requests to controllers. So the route says this mix of verb and URL goes to this controller function. Okay, pretty cool. Okay, now I could do, if you're building an API, you would just send JSON just like this, and you would send whatever data you want to send back as data. You would send it as some JavaScript object with the shape that you want. But what if you wanted to send like pages? Like writing the entire HTML here is a little bit tedious. A little tedious. So you have a couple different options. So again, so this is a catch-all route. This is just like, we'll just say is a get route to /cheese. Okay. We may not, I mean, we're already halfway through, so I don't know how many branches we're really going to have. But what I can do, I have two options for like delivering HTML. That's not just having to type in whole strings of HTML like this. You could use what's called middleware. Now, middleware are functions that can be run before your routes. That's the simplest way to think about them. A little bit more complicated than that, but they're just functions that get run on every request, but before your routes. So usually you declare them before your routes. So basically, if we were to think about your app in sections, there's your setup. So your setup is where we import, express, and create our app object. So there's your setup. And again, here's where we're going to import dependencies, which I'm going to shorthand as deps, and create app object. So that's our setup. That's always going to come first. Then we're going to have the section where we're going to declare our middleware. That's generally always going to be the next thing you do after the setup. Okay, declare middleware. Then you're going to declare your routes, which is we've done a little bit of. And sometimes you also declare things that are called routers. Routers are going to be bundles of routes that you define in another file. because writing all the code in one file gets tedious. So what you can do is you can create a router, which is like a clump of bundled routes, and then use them as middleware here. But we won't necessarily worry about that yet. Okay, and then the last piece of the setup is set up our server listener. Okay, so that's a good way to kind of think of the different parts of, like, if you're trying to set up this file in sort of an organized way. And the way you set up middleware is you take your application object, which again we have saved in the web server variable, and it has a use function. And it just means it's going to run this function before it goes on to the next thing. So before it does these things, like what, you know, webserver.all and webserver.get, it's going to use whatever function I pass in here. So one option I have is express.static. And what I can do is I can name a folder. Typically what you do is you name a folder called public. And what this does is that you're creating a folder that can be a place to host just files. Like images you want to make available, CSS files, or even HTML files. You can put in this public folder. So for example, if I put in here a file called boop.html, and I just put an h1 here, h1 boop /h1. Okay, now that file is being served statically. Now notice, the way the public folder works is that it basically assumes that you're starting from here. So in that case, to access the files inside that public folder, I just type in there how to get to them from here. So I would type in boop.html. And there it is, boop. And if you've done web development back in the day, you probably are familiar with the idea that index files are always like the default file. So technically, if I were to create an index.html here, file, index.html, I can be like h1 main page. And what this does, again, if it's treating the main host as like the beginning of public, that means literally this will mean the public folder, assuming there's no routes otherwise. But since this would represent the public folder, by default it's going to look for an index.html. So then I get the index.html's output. Okay, same thing with any folder. So if I were to create another folder in public called we, actually that should be a folder. So let's create a folder called we, and then put a index.html in the we folder, h1 we. If I do that, okay, now I go to /we, I get the file. But even though I didn't say index.html, whenever I point it to a folder, it'll automatically look for an index.html in that folder. So always just realize index always tend to be sort of like these default files that when you specify a folder, you always look for a file with the name of index. Whether it's, you know, you're importing a file in JavaScript and it looks for an index.js, or you're importing a folder, or you're referring to a folder in a URL, and it's going to refer to that folder based on your web server settings. Okay? And looks for an index.html. But otherwise, those are just normal HTML files. I can put photos in here, whatever I need for my project. So that's one way I could deliver HTML content. But for that, I could just not create a whole web server. I could just make a bunch of HTML files and just upload them to like Netlify or Vercel. That's not too exciting. I really want to take advantage of this whole back-end thing and be able to do things dynamically. That's where you start using like template rendering or server-side rendering, which means we're going to have our server do the work of actually generating pages for us. Okay, and there's a bunch of different templating libraries out there. Okay, lots of them. Let's see here. Let's just do a quick Google search. Popular JavaScript templating libraries, and they all pretty much do the same thing. Okay, here's 5 of them. Okay, so there's like Mustache. Okay, there is underscore. I don't think I've used that one before. EJS, that's what we'll be using in a moment. Okay, handlebars, J templating, and so many more. Like if I go to npmjs.com and I look up like Express template engine, I'm going to find all sorts of different choices. So there's handlebars, liquid's what Shopify uses. Not a bad thing to learn in case you want to apply for like a Shopify developer job. Pug, which is what Jade is called now. Boxwood, Edge, it just goes on and on and on. Okay, you can find a templating engine for every style you would want to write templates in. Okay, so that's that. We're going to use EJS. Mainly because Express lets you use EJS with like minimal setup. But generally, if you go to any templating engine, you can just like click on it here in npm JS, and most of the time they'll give you some documentation. So for example, let's see here, a Express Svelte. So if I want to use like the Svelte syntax for writing templates, I can, here shows you the basic setup and how to use it, and you read the documentation and you can set it up. Okay, we're not going to use this again. We're going to keep it easy. We're going to use EJS. So I'm going to shut off the server for a second, and I'm going to npm install EJS. Done. Easy peasy. Okay. So now I can go back to server.js, and let's create another route. I don't even need to import anything or do anything for EJS. That's like the beauty of EJS. It's just super simple. Like it just kind of works out of the box. So all I have to do is I just create another route. So we'll say web server and .get, and we'll say /render. Okay, and a cool thing you can do is you can actually put variables in the URL. So I'm going to say render variable. Okay, so we're going to have a variable named variable. Okay, so this colon represents that this piece of the URL is going to be like a piece of data that I want to grab. And it'll save it in a variable called variable, which you'll see in a second. And again, so that's the URL, and then a function that we want to respond with, recres. Again, always the function is the second argument. But in this time, instead of using res.send, we're going to use res.render, which means I want to render a template. So I'm saying, hey, I'm going to want to render a template, which means it's like it's going to look like HTML with like little holes in it. Think of it like Mad Libs, where I'm creating like the Mad Libs is like a template, and you have to fill in the gaps. Same deal here. So we're saying I want to render this file. So the file we're going to want to render is, we'll say render.ejs. Okay, so that's going to be the name of the file. And the thing is that by default, since we didn't do any kind of setup, it's going to assume that whatever the file extension is, that is the thing we're using to render. So if you were using handlebars and you didn't want to do the whole setup, you would make sure you put the name of the library in. Because again, I installed EJS, and you can see here, see what's EJS's name? EJS. If I wanted to do something more custom, I'd have to do some configuring, but why? It just works. Okay, so I'm just going to say, hey, this is the file I want to render. We're going to make the file in a second. And then afterwards, you can specify a JavaScript object with any data that you want to fill the holes in the template. Again, what do you want to fill the Mad Libs with? And then you have to give each thing a name. So I'm going to say, we're going to call v for variable, and that this v variable is going to equal rec.params.variable. Now, what is this? Params is what you call these URL variables. Okay, anytime you use those colons, those are called params, and they get stored in an object called rec.params. So we're going to say rec.params, and then I grab the param by the name that I gave it. I gave it the name variable, so it's inside the rec.params object under the name variable. So now what you do is whenever you use this render function, by default, the way Express is built is that it looks for a folder called views. Okay, so there's no negotiating on that one. It's got to be called views. You can change it, but why? Okay, so if I make a new file and we call it render.ejs, because that's what we said it was going to be called, I can go in here and say h1, your param is, okay, And then I can say your param is, and then just say h2, and then I can use that param. And what you do is you use this syntax here, like angle bracket percentage equal sign means I want to inject something in there. So percentage equal sign, and we called it v, that was the variable. So what's going to happen is that the render function is going to take this file, EJS, read it, and it's going to pick up on this little like placeholder here. Like this is our little Mad Libs blank spot. And it's going to go back and take a look at the object that we passed in and be like, oh, okay, is there something called v in that object? Let me take a look. Oh, there is something called v in that object. So that means whatever this is needs to be in that spot. And then it's going to return that HTML. So let me turn the server back on. Nodemon server.js. And then if I go back over here, so again, I think the URL was /render. Wait, is that what it was? Oh, /render/variable. /render/she. So again, the URLs have to match. So you notice I got the catch-all because I didn't put the right URL. Because it's looking for that whole thing. It's looking for render and the other piece. So I'll say render/cheese. And see, it says your param is cheese. That's what I put in the URL. Again, this was the variable. But if I say Gouda, my param is Gouda. Now there's another cool thing you can do, another way you can transmit information in URLs via what's called a URL query. A URL query always starts at the end of the URL with a question mark. And then what you're allowed to do is pass in keys and values. So I can be like cheese equals Gouda. That is one query. So I'm saying there's a key called cheese whose value is Gouda. And then I can add more by using an ampersand and say bread equals rye. And I can just keep going on. Now right now that does nothing for me because I didn't program it to do anything. But what we can do is I can go back to here, and we'll just say this is going to be an object called Q. And Q is going to equal rec.query. So anything that's in the URL query gets stored in this rec.query object. So now I can go back to my render.ejs here, and I can say your h1, your query is... Now here's the thing, I want to loop over these queries, so that way no matter how many queries you add, it'll loop over it. So I can use EJS to kind of inject JavaScript. That's why it's called EJS, Embeddable Javascript. Basically what I can do is I can set up these little, like in these little brackets, and I can inject JavaScript in there. So I can say for query, use a for of loop. And then what I can do is I can take that object, like that query object, and turn it into an array. So I'll say object.entries. This is a function that basically turns each key value pair into an array of the key and the value. So object.entries, Q. Okay, because again, that was the key that we stored the query object back in server.js, so we called it Q in this object with all the things we're using in our template. So again, we're rendering this template with these variables. So again, I'm starting this loop, and then again, I want to make sure that I open the loop, because again, it's the same syntax as JavaScript, so that means this needs parentheses. Okay, so it's written the way you would write it in JavaScript. That's why it's called embeddable JavaScript. You're embedding JavaScript in your HTML file. So again, this is essentially the beginning of the for loop. Then I'll set up the end of the for loop. I always just like to set it up first before I actually write what it does, because again, the loop's going to have these curly brackets. And now what's going to happen is that it's going to loop and do whatever I put in between over and over again. So we're going to say h3. Actually, we'll start off with an h. We'll start off with we'll actually just make it a ul. We're going to tuck this loop inside of a ul. So I'm going to say ul here, and let me just take the end of the ul and make it in here. So essentially, really what we're going to have is a li, is what we're looping over. And in each li, it's going to be query, because again, essentially we're looping over the array that this function creates, and then it's a for of loop, so I'm storing the thing in the array in this variable called query. So I'm saying query 1, because object.entries creates an array, and the first value is always the key, and the second, it's an array of arrays. So in each array in the array, the first value is the key, and the second thing is the value. So I can say 0, because that's going to be the key, colon. Wait, why did I put, wait, no, I messed that up. And, okay, so I want to inject the query. So again, to inject something, it's open percentage sign equals. So it'd be query 0. Okay, then I close that. Then we put the colon to separate the key and the value. And then, again, we're going to inject something else. We're going to inject the value, which would be query 1. So essentially, this is looping over the query object and making an li in the list for each one. So let's watch it in action. So if I hit enter here, see, your query is cheese, Gouda, bread, rye. And then if I add another key value pair, I say greeting equals hello, it's going to add another one. Because see, I was able to set up that sort of programmatic logic in the template. So I don't have to write all this HTML. I've set up the rules, the syntax, for it to write the HTML for me. Okay, and then I can, get fancier. I can import things like HTMX and Alpine to make it where I can do some more stuff on the front end, and have a lot of fun with it. Okay, but yeah. Now a couple more little fun, useful tools, and essentially that's like the gist of it. Like anytime I need more middleware, I'm going to add it here. Anytime I need more routes, and again, 3 ways I can respond for the most part. I can either send a text message with res.send, I can send JSON data with res.json, or I can send HTML either through the the express.static middleware, or through rendering templates using the templating system of my choice. In this case, we use DJS, but there's a whole bunch of them. Cool. And then again, if you really want to spice up your templates, I highly recommend checking out something called HTMX and Alpine. They can really spice up your HTML templates. Cool. A couple more little things. Now, typing in like nodemon server.js, node server.js can get a little tedious, especially later on when those commands might have extra things in them. So, a thing that you might want to do is use scripts. What I can do here is I can create scripts for commands that I want to run. So I can sit there and say, make a script called start, and you can call it whatever you want. Start, and whenever I run the start script, it's going to run node server.js. Whenever I run a script called dev, it's going to run nodemon server.js. Okay, so now to run these scripts, you just type in npm run, and then you type the name of the script you want to run. So if I want to run the dev script, I just type in npm run dev, and it's the same thing as if I typed in nodemon server.js. Very cool. Okay. That's cool. Let's show you a couple other pieces of middleware that are pretty useful. So just a couple quick bits before we hit the hour mark. Npm install Morgan. Also, let's do .env, and let's do cores, and let's not do cores. That's a discussion for another day. Morgan.env, I think that's a pretty good start. Okay, cool. And now that I've installed those libraries, what happens is I can use them. Okay. So now the .env library allows me to make secret variables. So the way it usually would work is you would bring in the library, and what I would do is I would say .env, so require .env config, and that's it. What this is going to do is going to look for a file called .env. So you're going to make a file called .env, which should be in your git ignore, because we don't want to push that up to GitHub. And you can make variables. And the syntax always just is the name equals, so I would say like cheese equals Gouda. Bread equals rye. And each variable gets its own line. Okay? And the reason is this way you can like store things like API keys, secrets for like token secrets, database URLs, stuff like that you want to store here in the .env, because you just don't want it on GitHub where people can like get your secret stuff. Okay, and then you would rehandle it and recreate the .env wherever you deploy. So you'd have to recreate these environmental variables in each environment in which you create your app. But the idea is that it's not pushed to GitHub, so it's safe. Okay, so now if I wanted to use these variables, again, I already brought in the .env. That's what this does. This makes those variables available. Okay, and now I can use them. So let's say I just wanted to like send, here, and then they're always stored in an object called process.env. Okay, watch like my intro to Node or any of my videos on Node or environmental variables to know more about what this process.env object is. But essentially, it's just where these variables get stored. So process.env, I'm going to have access to cheese, because that's what I said, specifically the one I said in here. So actually, let's change it to Munster, so we can see that. So now, if I go to, what was the URL for that again? If I go back to server.js, if I go to /cheese, it should send me a text message that equals that variable from my env file. So let's try it out. Let's see if that's the case. /cheese. Oh, the server's not running. Oops. So npm run dev. Let's try that again. And there it goes. It works. Munster. Okay. So that's all .env. It allows you to create like any like sensitive variables you can store in a .env file, which is a great way to make sure that you don't expose secret things that you want secret in version control. Cool. Now on top of that, process.env, we also installed Morgan. Morgan is a piece of middleware, so I would say const Morgan equals require Morgan. And this allows us to have logging. So I would just say here it's middleware, so I would say web server.use. We use the Morgan function, and we have to pass it one of these little presets. Okay, so VS Code will pick up on it. Typically I use Tiny. And now watch what happens. So I'm going to put this off to the side so you can see it in action. And now watch right here. When I go to the website, now we get logs. So see, it prints a little message detailing the request. This allows you to kind of like see like what request did come into your server, like how did your server interpret it? Did it send the right response? Because it sends like these response codes. So like 304, 200 generally is a good thing. Like for example, if I were to comment out our catch-all route and then try to go to like cheese 5 without the catch-all route, see I get the cannot get cheese 5, and notice it gets a 404, which is a message that means not found, like it didn't find a response for this particular URL. Okay, so if you ever want to know all the different codes, you can learn them here at HTTP Cat. There's also a dog one where you can see all of these by cat or dog. Someone should make an HTTP bird. HTTP bird. That might be a project worth undertaking. Yeah, maybe I'll do that. Okay. One of these days. Cool. So that's a thing. And the last thing I would like to cover is, oh yes, modules. Now nowadays you're starting to see there's a standard way of writing like imports and exports in JavaScript. Node was created before that standard was created, so like what Node had originally was built in was this Node module syntax, which uses require, and later on you'd learn about like module that exports to export it. But what if you wanted to use like the actual official JavaScript standard way, which is the ES module syntax? I could go change my package.json and just add a, I just have to add one little piece right here, module. So the key would be module. Actually, no. It would be type. The key is type, and the value is module. Okay, and now I can now refactor this to use ES module syntax, which would look like this. So instead, I would have to be like import .env from .env, and then I'd actually have to run the function. So it would be like .env.config. Okay, and then this would be, instead of be like import express from express. Okay, that line can be the same, and then this would be like import Morgan from Morgan. And now I'm using ES module syntax. But it will work, it only works if I turn this little like switch on in my package.json. If that's not there, then it's going to throw me an error because I'm not using require. Okay, so just keep it in case you really wanted to use ES modules instead of require. Okay, because maybe you've been doing a lot of React or Svelte, and now you're doing backend, and you just want to continue using imports the way you've been used to using imports. Okay, but see, it all still works the same. Okay, and if I go back, see all the. So hopefully this gives you a solid idea of like what Express can do, and sort of like all it is really you can tailor how a web server works. This code can get broken up into multiple files. Okay, like it doesn't all have to be in one file. You can watch some of my other videos in Express to kind of see how that would be done. But hopefully this kind of gives you just like a conceptual foundation that will make you code good. So have a great day and enjoy. My name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com.